September 9th, 1956. If you were alive that night, you remember exactly where you were sitting when Elvis Presley appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show. 60 million Americans, nearly half the country, gathered around their television sets in living rooms from New York to California. Parents expected another musical performance. Teenagers hoped for something more. But nobody, absolutely nobody, was prepared for what happened when Elvis started moving his hips. In 3 minutes and 20 seconds, a 21-year-old truck driver from Tupelo, Mississippi, would do something so dangerous, so threatening to the American way of life, that CBS executives made a decision that would change television history forever. They pointed the cameras at his face and refused to show his body. What happened in those 3 minutes didn't just create controversy. It split the nation in half, launched a cultural revolution, and almost destroyed the career of the man who would become the king of rock and roll. But the real story of that night, the one nobody talks about, is what Elvis was thinking when he walked off that stage. Before we dive into the moment that changed everything, if you want more untold stories from music history, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss what's coming next. The stage was set for disaster. 3 months before that fateful September night, Elvis Presley was already the most controversial figure in American entertainment. His appearances on Milton Berle's show in June had sent shockwaves through conservative America. Church groups picketed television stations. Newspaper editorials called him vulgar, obscene, a threat to decent society. One critic wrote that Elvis moved like a stripper, with an advanced case of St. Vitus dance. Parents across the nation were terrified that this young man with the greased hair and the dangerous smile was corrupting their children with something they couldn't even name. It wasn't just the music. It was the way he moved his body, the way his hips swiveled and thrust in time with the beat, the way teenage girls screamed and fainted when he performed. America in 1956 was a nation where married couples on television slept in separate beds, where the word pregnant couldn't be spoken on air, where even married couples kissing was considered risque. And here was Elvis Presley, gyrating on stage like nothing anyone had ever seen before. Ed Sullivan had sworn he would never put Elvis on his show. The veteran broadcaster, who had been on television since 1948 and was the most powerful man in American entertainment, publicly stated that Elvis Presley was not suitable for a family audience. Sullivan's Sunday night variety show was an institution, a program that 40 million Americans watched religiously every week. It was wholesome. It was safe. It featured acts that parents and children could watch together without embarrassment. Booking Elvis Presley would be like inviting danger into America's living rooms. But then something changed Sullivan's mind. Steve Allen, Sullivan's direct competitor, booked Elvis for his show on July 1st and scored massive ratings. Allen had tried to tame Elvis by putting him in a tuxedo and having him sing to a basset hound, a stunt designed to humiliate the young singer and make him acceptable to mainstream audiences. The ratings were enormous, but the damage to Elvis's image was significant. Critics said Allen had neutered him, turned the dangerous rebel into a performing seal. Sullivan's team saw an opportunity. They approached Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's manager, with an offer that was impossible to refuse. 3 appearances for $50,000, an astronomical sum in 1956, making Elvis the highest-paid performer in television history. Parker negotiated hard, knowing that Sullivan needed Elvis more than Elvis needed Sullivan after the ratings disaster of appearing castrated on Steve Allen's show. The deal was struck in early August, and CBS began promoting Elvis's appearance with an intensity usually reserved for presidential addresses. The network knew they had something explosive on their hands. They just didn't know how explosive it would become. Rehearsal day, the first warning signs. September 9th, 1956. Started like any other day at CBS Studio 50 in New York City. The Ed Sullivan Show was a well-oiled machine, a production that had run smoothly for 8 years without major incident. Performers arrived, rehearsed, performed, and went home. Simple, professional, family-friendly. But when Elvis Presley walked into the studio that Sunday afternoon for his rehearsal, accompanied by his guitarist Scotty Moore, bassist Bill Black, and drummer DJ Fontana, something in the atmosphere changed immediately. Studio personnel who had worked with hundreds of performers over the years later said they'd never seen anything like it. There was electricity in the air, a sense that something significant was about to happen. The afternoon rehearsal was scheduled for 2 p.m. A small audience of CBS employees, their families, and a handful of lucky fans who had somehow gotten wind of the rehearsal time gathered in the studio. Elvis and his band ran through their set list: Don't Be Cruel, Love Me Tender, and Ready Teddy. During the rehearsal, Elvis performed the way he always performed, holding nothing back, moving his body with the same uninhibited energy that had made him famous and infamous in equal measure. The reaction was immediate and alarming to network executives watching from the control room. Teenage girls in the audience screamed so loudly that Ed Sullivan, who was recovering from a car accident and wouldn't actually host the show that night, sent word from his hospital bed that there might be a problem. The substitute host, Charles Laughton, a distinguished British actor, looked genuinely confused by the pandemonium unfolding before him. In the control room, CBS executives were having an emergency meeting. The switchboard was already lighting up with calls from people who had somehow heard about the rehearsal, demanding that Elvis not be allowed on air. Religious groups were calling. Parents' organizations were calling. Even sponsors were expressing concern. One executive proposed canceling Elvis's appearance entirely, arguing that the potential backlash wasn't worth the ratings. Another suggested that maybe they could have Elvis perform behind a curtain, letting the audience hear him but not see him. The ideas were getting more desperate by the minute. But then someone proposed a solution that seemed perfect in its simplicity. Just film him from the waist up. Don't show his hips, don't show his legs. Just show his face and his torso. Keep the performance family-friendly while still delivering the Elvis Presley that fans wanted to see. The order went out to camera operators at approximately 4:30 p.m., 2.5 hours before Elvis was scheduled to perform live. The memo was explicit. Waist up only, no exceptions, no matter what happens on stage. Camera operators who had been filming television for years were being told to essentially censor a performer in real time to make editorial decisions during a live broadcast about what American audiences were allowed to see. Some of them objected, arguing that it would look strange, that viewers would notice the odd framing. Others worried about the technical challenges of keeping the cameras locked on Elvis's upper body if he moved around the stage unpredictably. But the decision had been made at the highest levels, and there was no appealing it. America would see Elvis Presley's face, but not his body. They would hear the music, but not see the movement that made the music come alive. But nobody told Elvis. Here's what makes that night even more remarkable. Elvis Presley had no idea that CBS was planning to censor him. Colonel Parker knew, but he deliberately kept the information from his young client. Parker understood something crucial about Elvis's performance style. If Elvis knew he was being censored, if he knew that cameras weren't showing his full body, he might try to compensate by exaggerating his movements, or worse, he might shut down entirely. Deliver a safe, sanitized performance that would kill his career momentum. Parker wanted Elvis to perform naturally, to be himself, to deliver the same electricity that had made him a star. The censorship would happen invisibly, without Elvis's knowledge or consent. It was a calculated risk, and Parker knew that if Elvis found out later, there would be hell to pay. But in that moment, protecting the performance was more important than Elvis's feelings. Elvis stood in the wings at 7:58 p.m., 2 minutes before his scheduled appearance. He was wearing a dark suit, his hair perfectly styled in the pompadour that had become his trademark, his acoustic guitar slung over his shoulder. Charles Lawton was on stage, delivering the introduction with the kind of theatrical gravitas that only a Shakespearean actor could muster. In the audience, 60 million Americans were settling in front of their television sets. Families gathered together, teenage girls who had begged their parents to let them watch, critics who were ready to condemn whatever Elvis did. The ratings would show that nearly half of all Americans with televisions were watching at that exact moment, making it one of the most watched broadcasts in television history up to that point. The pressure on Elvis's shoulders was immeasurable, but if he felt it, he didn't show it. Later, people who were backstage that night said Elvis seemed calm, focused, almost zen-like in his concentration. He was about to walk into a firestorm, and he had no idea. The music starts and everything changes. When Elvis walked onto that stage, the screaming started before he even reached the microphone. The studio audience, which numbered about 600 people, erupted in a sound that can only be described as hysteria. Teenage girls were standing on their chairs, crying, reaching toward the stage with desperate hands. Elvis smiled that crooked smile, positioned himself in front of the microphone, and counted off the band. The opening chords of "Don't Be Cruel" filled the studio, and Elvis's body immediately responded to the rhythm. His hips started moving, subtle at first, then more pronounced. His legs were shaking, his shoulders rolling, his entire body becoming an instrument of the music. In the control room, camera operators were frantically adjusting their shots, trying to keep Elvis's lower body out of frame while still making the coverage look natural and intentional. What viewers at home saw was strange and disorienting. The camera angles were tight, focused almost exclusively on Elvis's face and chest. When he moved too much to one side or the other, the camera would jerk awkwardly to follow him, always keeping that invisible line at his waist. Some shots were so tightly framed that Elvis's head nearly touched the top of the screen. Viewers who had seen Elvis on other shows immediately noticed the difference. Letters would start arriving at CBS before the show was even over, asking why the cameras were positioned so strangely, why they couldn't see Elvis's full performance. The censorship was obvious to anyone paying attention, but that only made it more intriguing. What were the cameras hiding? What was Elvis doing that was so dangerous that CBS couldn't show it? The forbidden fruit became even more tempting. In the studio, however, the full Elvis Presley experience was on display. Audience members who were there that night would spend the rest of their lives talking about it. They saw everything, the complete, uncensored performance that television audiences were being protected from. And what they saw wasn't obscene or vulgar or pornographic, as critics had claimed. It was a young man, moving with natural rhythm and energy, translating his Mississippi gospel and blues roots into something new and vital. His movements were sexual, in the way that all great music and dance is sexual, tapping into something primal and honest about the human experience. But in 1950s America, that honesty was more threatening than any explicit content could have been. Elvis was breaking an unspoken rule of post-war American culture. Bodies were supposed to be controlled, contained, sanitized for public consumption. Elvis's body was wild, free, unapologetic. The performance lasted 3 minutes and 20 seconds. When it ended, the studio audience was in chaos. Girls were crying, screaming Elvis's name, some of them trying to rush the stage before security guards gently but firmly guided them back to their seats. Elvis took a small bow, that shy Mississippi smile still on his face, seemingly unaware of the cultural earthquake he had just triggered. He performed twice more that night, Love Me Tender and Ready Teddy, each time with the same energy and passion, each time with the cameras carefully framing him from the waist up. By the time the show ended at 9 p.m., the CBS switchboard was overloaded with calls. Some were praising the network for taking a moral stand. Others were condemning the censorship as un-American. But everyone was talking about Elvis Presley. The aftermath. America splits in half. The Monday morning newspapers revealed just how deeply divided America had become over 3 minutes of television. The New York Times ran a front-page story about the Elvis phenomenon, treating it as a serious cultural and sociological event rather than mere entertainment news. Conservative columnists condemned CBS for even allowing Elvis on television, arguing that the waist-up camera angles didn't go far enough, that the network should have canceled his appearance entirely. Religious leaders across the country used their Sunday sermons, just 1 week later, to denounce Elvis and rock and roll music as tools of Satan, designed to corrupt American youth and destroy Christian values. One Baptist minister in Des Moines, Iowa, proclaimed from his pulpit that Elvis Presley was a whirling dervish of sex who would lead America's children to hell. A Catholic diocese in New Jersey banned Elvis's records from being played at any church-affiliated event. The backlash was swift, organized, and deadly serious. But for every adult condemning Elvis, there were 10 teenagers defending him. Record stores across America reported that Don't Be Cruel and Love Me Tender sold out within hours of the broadcast. Radio stations that played Elvis saw their ratings soar. Fan clubs were forming in every city and town. Teenage girls organizing themselves into armies dedicated to defending their idol from the attacks of the older generation. Letters poured into CBS, and while many condemned the network, many more thanked them for bringing Elvis into their homes. The divide wasn't just generational, it was ideological. Conservative America saw Elvis as a threat to everything they held dear: traditional values, sexual restraint, racial boundaries, that rock and roll was beginning to blur. Progressive America saw Elvis as liberation, as authenticity, as the future breaking free from the repressive past. Ed Sullivan himself, still recovering from his car accident, watched the broadcast from his hospital bed and immediately understood what he had on his hands. The ratings were astronomical, crushing every competing program, proving that Elvis Presley was the biggest draw in television history. Sullivan made a decision that night that would define the rest of Elvis's appearances on his show. If America wanted to see Elvis, Sullivan would give them Elvis, but on his terms, controlled, sanitized. safe enough for family viewing, but exciting enough to deliver ratings. The censorship would continue, but it would be promoted as protection rather than suppression. CBS issued a statement the next day defending their decision to film Elvis from the waist up, claiming they were simply maintaining standards of good taste appropriate for a family program. They didn't mention the emergency meetings, the panicked phone calls, the explicit instructions to camera operators. The official story was that this had all been planned, a reasonable compromise between Elvis's artistic expression and the network's responsibility to their audience. Elvis finds out, and nothing is ever the same. 3 days after the broadcast, Elvis was in Memphis, Tennessee, taking a rare break from his relentless touring and recording schedule. He was at Graceland, the mansion he had purchased earlier that year for his parents, when Colonel Parker arrived with a stack of newspapers and a carefully prepared speech. Parker knew he had to tell Elvis about the censorship before the young singer heard it from someone else. The conversation that followed has never been fully documented, but people who were at Graceland that day later said they heard raised voices, doors slamming, a level of anger from Elvis that few people had ever witnessed. Elvis felt betrayed, not by CBS, but by his own manager, who had kept the censorship secret from him. He had walked onto that stage believing he was giving a full, honest performance, only to discover that millions of viewers had seen a manipulated, sanitized version of his art. For several hours, there was serious discussion about Elvis canceling his remaining 2 appearances on the Ed Sullivan Show. The contract guaranteed him 3 shows, but Elvis wanted to walk away, to refuse to participate in his own censorship. But Parker, ever the pragmatist, showed Elvis the numbers. The ratings were unprecedented. Record sales had exploded. Elvis's fee for the remaining 2 appearances was guaranteed, more money than most Americans would earn in a lifetime. And perhaps most importantly, the censorship had made Elvis more famous, not less. The forbidden nature of his full performance had created a mystique, a sense that viewers were missing something important and dangerous. Teenage fans who had seen Elvis on earlier, uncensored programs knew what the cameras were hiding, and they talked about it endlessly, spreading the legend of Elvis's dangerous movements through word of mouth more effectively than any television broadcast could have done. Elvis eventually agreed to honor the contract, but something fundamental had changed in him. Friends and band members noticed it immediately. The shy, polite young man from Tupelo became harder, more cynical, more aware of how the entertainment industry worked, and how he was being manipulated and controlled by forces beyond his understanding. The innocence was gone, replaced by a calculating awareness of his own image and the power he held. In later interviews, Elvis would rarely discuss that first Ed Sullivan Show appearance. But when he did, there was always a note of sadness in his voice, a sense of something lost that could never be recovered. September 9th, 1956 was the night Elvis Presley became a superstar, but it was also the night he lost a part of himself that could never be reclaimed. The second and third appearances, escalation and control. Elvis's second appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show on October 28, 1956, was even more carefully controlled than the first. CBS had learned from the initial broadcast, and this time there was no question about camera angles or censorship protocols. Elvis would be filmed from the waist up, period. But something else was different this time. Ed Sullivan was back, fully recovered from his car accident, and he had made it his personal mission to domesticate Elvis Presley on national television. Sullivan's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. He would legitimize Elvis by treating him not as a dangerous rebel, but as a polite, respectful young man who deserved to be welcomed into America's living rooms. During the broadcast, Sullivan praised Elvis effusively, calling him a real decent, fine boy, and shaking his hand warmly on camera. The message was clear. Ed Sullivan approved of Elvis Presley, and therefore America could approve of him too. The performance itself was electric, despite the camera restrictions. Elvis sang "Don't Be Cruel," "Love Me Tender," and "Hound Dog," and the studio audience screamed just as loudly as they had during the first appearance. But this time, Elvis seemed more controlled, more aware of the cameras and how he was being framed. He played to the camera angles, keeping his movements more centered, making sure his face and expressions were doing the work that his full body had done before. It was a masterclass in adaptation, showing that Elvis was more than just a performer with provocative dance moves. He was an artist who could communicate emotion and energy through his voice and facial expressions alone. Critics who had dismissed Elvis as merely a sex symbol were forced to reconsider. Maybe there was real talent underneath the controversy. The third and final appearance, on January 6, 1957, became the most famous and most controversial of all. By this point, Elvis's dominance of American popular culture was complete. He had the #1 song, the #1 album, and had just finished filming his first movie. The pressure on CBS to continue the censorship was enormous, with religious groups and parents' organizations monitoring every moment of the broadcast. But Elvis had also gained power and confidence. He knew what he was worth to the network, and he wasn't willing to be completely controlled anymore. During rehearsal, there were heated discussions about the performance. Elvis wanted to perform his new song, "Hound Dog," with full energy and movement. CBS wanted to maintain the waist-up framing that had become standard. The compromise reached was that the cameras would occasionally pull back to show Elvis's full body, but only for brief moments, never lingering on his lower half for more than a few seconds. What happened during that final performance has been analyzed and debated by music historians for decades. Elvis performed "Hound Dog" with more intensity and energy than he had shown on the previous 2 appearances, almost daring the cameras to keep up with him. At several moments, the framing broke down completely, and viewers at home got brief glimpses of Elvis's full body in motion, his legs shaking, his hips moving in the way that had caused so much controversy. The studio audience went absolutely wild, and even Ed Sullivan seemed slightly overwhelmed by the energy in the room. After the performance, Sullivan delivered his famous closing remarks, praising Elvis one more time for being a decent, fine boy who had brought tremendous entertainment to the show. It was Sullivan's way of putting his stamp of approval on Elvis one final time, legitimizing him for mainstream America while simultaneously ending the most explosive chapter in television history. The Cultural Revolution. That followed the impact of those 3 Ed Sullivan Show appearances cannot be overstated. Before Elvis, television was a medium of conformity, a window into an idealized American life where everyone was polite, restrained, and followed the rules. After Elvis, television would never be the same. The censorship of his body, intended to protect American values, had instead created a fascination with the forbidden. Teenagers who had been raised on wholesome family programming suddenly understood that there was something else out there, something raw and real and exciting that the adult world was trying to keep from them. The generation gap that would explode in the 1960s with the counterculture movement had its origins in those three performances, when America's youth realized that their parents' values were not their values, and that they had the power to choose something different. Rock and roll, which had been a marginal genre before Elvis, became the dominant force in American popular music almost overnight. Artists who had been playing to small, mostly black audiences suddenly found themselves with crossover appeal, as white teenagers who had discovered Elvis went searching for the roots of the music that excited them so much. Little Richard, Chuck Berry, Fats Domino, these pioneers of rock and roll suddenly had white audiences at their shows, breaking down racial barriers in ways that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. The civil rights movement, which was gaining momentum in 1956, found an unexpected ally in rock and roll music, as young white Americans began to question why the music they loved was being played by black artists they were told to fear and avoid. Elvis himself, though he never considered himself a civil rights activist, played a crucial role in this cultural shift simply by popularizing music that had originated in black communities. The censorship of Elvis's performances also had an unintended consequence for television as a medium. Networks realized that controversy could be controlled and monetized, that pushing boundaries while maintaining the appearance of propriety could deliver massive ratings without serious consequences. This lesson would shape television programming for decades to come, leading to increasingly provocative content that was carefully calibrated to shock without truly offending. Elvis had shown that you could be dangerous and commercially successful at the same time, and every network executive in America took note. The variety shows and talent competitions that dominated television in the late 1950s and early 1960s all followed the template established by Elvis's Ed Sullivan appearances. Find someone exciting and controversial, give them a platform, but control them carefully enough to avoid alienating sponsors and mainstream audiences. What it cost Elvis. But while America was being transformed by Elvis's television appearances, the cost to Elvis himself was mounting. The censorship, the controversy, the constant scrutiny of every move he made took a psychological toll that few people understood at the time. Elvis had grown up poor in Mississippi, had worked as a truck driver, had never imagined that his love of music would make him the most famous person in America. The sudden transformation from obscurity to omnipresence was disorienting and traumatic. He couldn't go anywhere without being mobbed by fans. He couldn't have normal relationships because every girl he dated instantly became a celebrity herself. His family's privacy was destroyed, their lives in Memphis constantly interrupted by fans and reporters camping outside their home. Elvis's mother Gladys, who had been his anchor and protector throughout his childhood, began to crack under the pressure, developing anxiety and turning to alcohol to cope with the stress of her son's fame. Elvis dealt with his own stress by retreating into work, recording constantly, touring relentlessly, making movies on punishing schedules. But work couldn't solve the fundamental problem. Elvis Presley, the person, had been consumed by Elvis Presley, the phenomenon. The young man who loved gospel music and wanted to use his talent to bring joy to people had been transformed into a symbol, a lightning rod for America's anxieties about youth culture, sexuality, race, and change. Every move he made was analyzed and criticized. Every song he released was either praised as genius or condemned as garbage, with little middle ground. The pressure to maintain his image, to stay on top, to keep delivering the performances that made him famous became overwhelming. And the censorship of his television appearances had taught Elvis a bitter lesson. No matter how talented he was, no matter how hard he worked, there would always be forces trying to control him, to shape him into something safe and acceptable. In later years, Elvis would rarely watch recordings of his early television appearances. When asked about the Ed Sullivan shows, he would usually change the subject or give vague, diplomatic answers. The joy and spontaneity that had characterized his early performances gradually disappeared, replaced by a more calculated, controlled stage presence. By the late 1960s, Elvis had largely retreated from live performance, focusing on movies that required him to follow scripts and choreography, giving him no opportunity for the kind of spontaneous expression that had made him famous. When he finally returned to live performance in 1968 with his legendary comeback special, it was clear that something essential had been lost. He was still talented, still charismatic, still capable of moving audiences. But the young man who had walked onto that Ed Sullivan Show stage in 1956, innocent and unaware of the firestorm he was about to create, was gone forever. The legacy, a nation forever changed. Today, when we watch those old black and white clips of Elvis on the Ed Sullivan Show, it's hard to understand what all the fuss was about. His movements seem tame compared to what we see on television every day, his performances downright wholesome by contemporary standards. But context is everything. In 1956, Elvis Presley didn't just challenge the status quo, he obliterated it. He showed that young people could have their own culture, their own music, their own values, that didn't align with what their parents believed. He demonstrated that sexuality and artistic expression were inseparable, that trying to censor the body while celebrating the art was a fundamental contradiction. And he proved that America was not the monolithic, unified culture that post-war propaganda had portrayed, but rather a nation of competing visions, generational conflicts, and deep disagreements about what freedom and decency really meant. The censorship of those performances became a template that would be repeated throughout the decades that followed. Every new musical movement, from the British invasion to punk rock to hip-hop to heavy metal, would face similar moral panics, similar attempts at control and suppression. And every time, the censorship would backfire, making the forbidden music more appealing rather than less. Elvis had inadvertently taught America's youth a lesson that would echo through the generations. When adults tell you that something is too dangerous for you to see or hear, that's exactly what you need to seek out. The forbidden became fascinating, and the more authorities tried to protect young people from controversial art, the more determined those young people became to experience it for themselves. The 3 Ed Sullivan Show appearances also marked the beginning of television's evolution, from a medium of pure entertainment to a cultural battlefield where America's conflicts would be fought in real time. Before Elvis, television had been relatively apolitical, a space where everyone could agree on what was appropriate and acceptable. After Elvis, television became contested territory, a place where different visions of America would clash and compete. This transformation would reach its peak in the 1960s, when television news coverage of the Vietnam War and civil rights movement would bring the nation's divisions into living rooms across America. But the seeds of that transformation were planted in September 1956 when CBS executives made the decision to censor Elvis Presley's body, and in doing so, acknowledged that television was no longer a safe space where everyone agreed on the rules. September 9th, 1956, the day that never ended in the end. September 9th, 1956. Wasn't just a date on the calendar. It was a dividing line in American cultural history, a before and after moment that changed everything that came after it. Before that night, America could still pretend it was the unified, wholesome nation that post-war mythology had created. After that night, the illusion was shattered. The genie was out of the bottle, and it could never be put back in. Elvis Presley, a shy young man from Mississippi who just wanted to make music, had accidentally started a revolution, and the decision to censor his television performances, intended to protect American values, had instead highlighted how fragile and contested those values really were. The 60 million Americans who watched that first Ed Sullivan Show broadcast witnessed something unprecedented in television history: the live, real-time negotiation of what was acceptable in American popular culture. The tight camera framing, the obvious attempts to hide Elvis's body from view. These weren't just production choices. They were statements about power, about who got to decide what Americans could see and experience. And the fact that the censorship was so visible, so obvious, meant that viewers were forced to think about it, to question it, to form their own opinions about whether it was necessary or ridiculous. That process of questioning, authority, of deciding for yourself what was appropriate, rather than accepting what you were told, was perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of the entire event. Elvis himself never fully recovered from the intensity of that period. The fame, the controversy, the censorship, the constant pressure to maintain his image while also being authentic. It was an impossible burden for a 21-year-old to carry. In many ways, the rest of Elvis's career was an attempt to escape from the shadow of those early performances, to find a way to be an artist without being a phenomenon. He made movies, hoping that acting would give him a new avenue of expression. He served in the army, hoping that patriotic service would legitimize him in the eyes of his critics. He married Priscilla and started a family, hoping that domesticity would make him seem less dangerous. But none of it worked. Elvis was trapped by his own legend, by the image that had been created during those 3 Ed Sullivan Show appearances. He was forever the king, whether he wanted to be or not. The cameras that had been trained on Elvis's face that September night, carefully avoiding his moving hips and legs, captured something that went far beyond a musical performance. They captured the moment when America's youth realized they had power, when a generation discovered that they didn't have to accept the values and restrictions imposed by their elders. They captured the beginning of the youth culture that would dominate the second half of the 20th century. They captured the death of post-war innocence and the birth of modern popular culture. And they captured a young man, talented and ambitious and terrified, walking into a firestorm that would consume the rest of his life. September 9th, 1956. 3 minutes and 20 seconds. A single television appearance, and nothing was ever the same again.